C2 and Lelouch shared so many special moments in this series, including their final on-screen interaction in Turn 24. But what makes this final conversation amazing and a perfect conclusion for these two? Well, in this video, you're gonna find out. Let's first talk about how we got here. After Lelouch prevents the Ragnarok connection, C2 was at a crossroad. She knew that Lelouch was never going to fulfill her contract, and she ended her relationship with Charles. Thus, staying with Lelouch no longer served any purpose. Despite this, she agreed to help Lelouch during the Zero Requiem instead of departing and going their separate ways. This showed her devotion to Lelouch and the growth of their relationship. C2 during the Zero Requiem acted as Lelouch's shield, a role she's had since day one. Her last time escorting him came in Turn 24, where Lelouch planned to board the Damocles to finish his fight against Schneisel. Lelouch heads to the hangar where C2 was waiting for him. This led to their final on-screen interaction. It begins with some fun banter between the two.
C2、無事だったのか？
珍しいな。心配してくれるのか？
大事な戦力だからな。
A callback to the fun moments they've engaged in throughout the series, including referencing how Lelouch genuinely cares about her. In the previous episode, C2 and Lelouch shared a heartfelt moment before the battle against Schneisel began, during which Lelouch expressed his doubts on seeing this through to the end. C2 also expressed her doubts specifically with fighting Nunnally, but Lelouch ultimately decided that he would do what he must. C2 then agrees with him. This is then referenced later on in their final conversation when Lelouch confirms his resolve to fight Nunnally if she stands against him. Remember that Lelouch considered the idea to be a joke when C2 first brought it up in Turn 6, but now Lelouch sees Nunnally more than just some feeble child. Something that gets discussed again in Lelouch of the Resurrection. Then C2 changes the topic to ask Lelouch,
ルルシュ、恨んでいないのか私のことを。ギアスを与えたことで、お前の運命は大きく変わってしまった。
I think she brought this up as a callback to their argument in stage 15. That was where Lelouch called C2 a monster, blaming her for what happened to Shirley. Lelouch expresses his confusion on why C2 would even ask this. C2 is an immortal witch who's forgotten so many that have died over her immortal life. Why would resolving this matter to her in the long run? It was a sign that C2 cared about Lelouch perhaps more than anyone else she's ever known. So she wanted to make sure there weren't any regrets or hard feelings before they part ways, maybe for the last time. This foreshadowed C2's actions later on during this conversation. Lelouch then surprises C2 by taking responsibility for his actions, a sign of character growth since he blamed others for his problems many times before this. In the end, Lelouch could only express gratitude to C2, who gave him a second chance in life. Considering Lelouch's time was coming to an end, having this mindset is what helped him die with a smile with no regrets. His response causes C2 to go from sadness to happiness, as Lelouch's words confirmed her feelings for him. She then tells him he's one in a million, which coming from an immortal means something. The two then walk towards each other, most likely going to hug or perhaps kiss, but Colin unknowingly pays C2 back for ruining her intimate moment with Lelouch by interrupting her intimate moment. Now, there's much debate during this part and the battle against Colin. Did C2 express romantic feelings for Lelouch? Does she love him? Well, taking the literal route, it's not as clear as C2 told Colin, but I always assumed that she did based on her actions and expressions during that scene. Sure, best friends can embrace before the end, but they usually don't do it like that. The manga shows another version of this conversation, which further convinced me of C2's true feelings. My interpretation of this conversation is that C2, in her own C2 way, wanted to confirm if her romantic feelings were mutual. She joked about his concern for her safety, discussed Nunnally, and finally brought up the elephant in the room, if he still hates her. By declaring he doesn't, C2 smiled and followed up with that line. One small detail that's easy to miss is that C2 took took several steps towards Lelouch as she declared her feelings. Then, Lelouch walked forward to her as a way to reciprocate them. She went 90 and Lelouch went 10. Despite the official statements by the creators themselves which state that Lelouch and C2 are not a romantic couple, I don't agree, and I don't see how you can interpret this scene as just two friends parting ways. If that were the case, the two would not have walked towards each other, and instead, Lelouch would have just followed C2 to Shinkiro and they would have just left a hanger in their nightmare frames. Or she would have immediately done something less romantic like a head nod or a request for a handshake. Maybe you disagree, let me hear it in the comment section below. But now let's get back to going over what happened in the final interaction. Before Colin can kill Lelouch, C2 stops her using the Lancelot Frontier. Lelouch expresses his concern for her safety as he has so many times before this. C2 thanks him for his concern, but urges him to complete his task and then come back to her, because doing that would make her smile. Lelouch then says,
ああ、約束しよう。
Now this part always confused me, because C2, like everyone else involved in the Zero Requiem, knew that Lelouch would die at the end. So since she knew he was going to die, what did she mean by asking him to return to her? The only answer I have relates to the time skip between Lelouch capturing the Damocles and his death. Sometime during that month, C2 and Lelouch must have reunited. It's unfortunate that it was never explained what happened during that time skip, and I can only hope that they will explain it sometime in the future. Anyways, I assume that C2 simply meant for Lelouch to survive his encounter with Schneisel, take control of the world, and then come back to her. If you think about it, it's quite beautiful that even though C2 knew Lelouch's death was inevitable, she still wanted to have as much time with him until the end. She had spent so much time with Lelouch, including protecting him, with this being the last time. Now, C2 would have to let Lelouch go. Despite its flaws, what's interesting about the alternative anime timeline is that when you combine it with the original timeline, the two explore different ways to handle death and loss. The first timeline is where C2 moved on in life, thanking Lelouch for giving her a reason to live again. The second timeline is where C2 isn't satisfied and wants to resurrect Lelouch because of his unfulfilled promise and her unwillingness to let him go, a concept further explored in the film Resurrection. And while I don't blame C2's attitude in a second timeline, it's still the wrong approach to handle a situation like that. It was better for C2 to thank Lelouch for everything, moving on in life, and in Lelouch's memory, do the one thing she couldn't: live. She expressed this desire during her fight against Colin while protecting Lelouch for the final time. One of the saddest parts to the Zero Requiem's conclusion is that C2 never got to be with Lelouch in the end, unlike everyone else. Instead, she remained in a random church, crying for Lelouch's death, acknowledging the cost of using his own Geass, giving humanity a future. C2 closes out Code Geass in one final monologue in which she expressed her gratitude for Lelouch's brief but significant impact on her life. And what's incredible is how that last interaction set all this up. It was fun banter between the two and the resolution of their past conflicts. How it demonstrated so much growth between the two characters with only a few lines of dialogue. Lelouch taking responsibility for his actions and C2 showing genuine concern for someone else despite being a selfish creature. The two parted ways with Lelouch dying to create a new world and C2 building upon that sacrifice by living for Lelouch in this new world. And the most critical part here is that the outcome of the last interaction determined this. If Lelouch still held a grudge, there's no way C2 would have made that speech at the end. She still would have defended him against Colin, but in that sad state before asking Lelouch that question. Lelouch relieved C2 of the last burden she carried, allowing her to start a new life. She can go on now without Lelouch and without regret, knowing he's satisfied with how everything turned out, which again speaks volumes for C2's character growth throughout Code Geass. It was quite a journey that would have never happened had Lelouch and Ribble not caused that accident so long ago. And this final interaction perfectly summed up the journey to that point, and just like the Zero Requiem opened up a future of infinite possibilities. As Gandalf once said,
No, the journey doesn't end here.
because in the alternative anime timeline, Lelouch and C2 got to spend more time together, and maybe they even got married. If you're curious to learn more, then check out this video right here.